Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Ashley Morgan, Director of the American Veterinary Medical Association's Division of State Advocacy. We appreciate your interest in learning how to be a stronger advocate for the veterinary profession. Please submit any questions via the question box, and we will answer them as we go. If we're not able to answer your question during the webinar, we will follow up with you afterwards. To start, let's talk about advocacy in general. What is advocacy, and why should you participate when there are associations that really do that work? Merriam-Webster defines advocacy as the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. And an important role played by organized veterinary medicine in our society is to help communicate and educate policymakers and their staff on issues of importance to the veterinary profession. The AVMA, state, and allied VMAs actively engage with legislators and regulators to help them make well-informed decisions. But no one is more important in this process than you, because you are the legislator's constituent. You vote in their elections. Your voice is essential. Policymakers must hear from you to make informed decisions. In fact, they want to hear from you, because you are the one who could tell them why an issue is of importance to their district and their constituents where you live and work. No one is better at bringing the legislators into the world of veterinary medicine than you. Your role is to translate the impact of potential policies from an idea on paper into real life. What may seem like a good idea may not be practical or appropriate. Using your knowledge, along with personal stories, you can demonstrate in a genuine way the impact of implementing a potential law or regulation. And you don't have to have been in practice for decades to do this. As a veterinary student or new graduate, you are better informed and more well-versed in veterinary medicine than almost any legislator or their staff. Like interacting with clients, you have valuable information and expertise to share. Veterinary medical associations formulate policies and positions to help guide their work in interaction with state boards and agencies and state and federal legislators. Being engaged in the policymaking process within associations is necessary and one important component of being a strong advocate that should not be overlooked. Our panelists will talk more about their engagement with organized veterinary medicine, but this includes volunteering to serve on committees, task forces, and working groups. With that, let's turn to our guest, Dr. Teller. Thanks for being here. Would you please share a little bit about yourself, including what motivated you to become involved in advocacy and in what ways you're currently engaged?
Sure. My name is Lori Teller, and I was in private practice for 28 years in Houston, Texas. And then I joined the faculty at Texas A&M, creating their telemedicine program. So my main job now is building a telemedicine program in academia. And I also teach in the primary care rotation there. So I still have my hand in practice, and I do still practice one day a month at the place where I came from. I'm also very active and engaged in organized veterinary medicine. I served as president of our local VMA and then the Texas VMA, and I now chair the board of directors for the AVMA. And I really got involved in advocacy way back when I was still involved at the local level, when some really crazy regulations were being considered around vaccination of animals, and then also when they started considering mandatory spay-neuter laws and what some of that looked like. And it became readily apparent that the people trying to create these policies and these laws really had no idea what they were talking about. And it was important that they hear from the veterinary community and get our side of it. And that's when I became engaged, and I have not stopped since.
Excellent, and we appreciate your engagement. Dr. Hornickel, how about you? A little bit about yourself and what motivated you to personally become involved in advocacy?
Yes, so I am a 2012 graduate of University of Minnesota. I started out my career in private practice, and still am in private practice right now, in mixed animal medicine in rural Wisconsin, and was heavily involved with organized veterinary medicine as a student, but that continued even early in practice, and I still am. 5 years ago now, so I'm out 8 years. 5 years ago, I moved to Seattle and now practice exclusively companion animal medicine in a private practice, and have last year was elected to the board of directors for the Washington State Veterinary Medical Association. And so again, remain engaged, and I've served as a key legislative contact as well since moving to Washington. And so I often meet with legislators, and that really started as a student. So that's kind of carried through, and I look forward to actually moving more into potentially a policy role down the road. I enjoy practice and I like it, but I'm also ready to explore other areas. And so, and a little bit of a unique experience for me too is I did my master's of public health before vet school. So I've kind of come into this from the 30,000 foot level population health, and then went through vet school and kind of synthesizing all of that now. So yeah, I can share more as we move on through this.
Excellent, great, thank you. And Dr. Kuhn, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm a 2018 grad, Michigan State, and after my DVM, I stayed on for a couple of years to finish out a PhD that I had started kind of as a dual degree program early on in my DVM. And probably late my first year or my second year, I can't remember, I did an AVMA fly-in event where they took students to DC. We went up on Capitol Hill and spoke with policymakers about issues that were affecting our industry. And that was kind of the time when it kind of clicked for me of a different path that I could take my career. At that time, I had kind of been, I really loved veterinary medicine, but I wasn't super passionate about practicing. I had thought I wanted to go at research at one point, and really just kind of fell out of love with research and was really struggling to find a place in the community of veterinary medicine. And going to that fly-in, I really saw a new path where I could still apply my education and my skills, but still stay out of practice and research. So I went to another fly-in. I joined my state VMA's legislative committee and just kind of started to dig in policy and trying to apply myself the different ways I could. As a third and fourth year vet student, I did externships with the FDA and AVMA in DC and just fell in love with it more and more. And so now in 2 weeks, I'll be starting with the Department of Defense as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. So I'll be kind of starting my career now in policy. I'm quite excited to actually be applying my knowledge now as a full-time position. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Great, excellent. A question here to start, pose it to all of you, but why do you think that advocacy is so important? I know, Lori, you talked about some of the issues or things that sort of piqued your interest and got you to sort of get involved, but why do you think that advocacy is important? Why is it important to be involved?
It's the only way to have any kind of logical resolution to some of the things that are proposed, whether it's your state legislature or on the Hill. There are lots of people there with great intentions, and they're getting information from lots of sources, many who are not always above board, I guess is the best way to put it. But they get lots of misinformation. And so they really need to be hearing from the experts when they're dealing with issues on animal welfare, veterinary medicine. Think of everything we've just been dealing with recently with COVID. So if we're not willing to provide that information, then it's really hard for us to complain about some of the things that end up getting passed. We need to be willing to step up to the plate and be the source of accurate and reliable scientific information.
Absolutely. I'll share a little bit too. Like Matt, I attended the legislative fly-in as a student. I actually had the opportunity to go twice because I helped plan one. But my biggest experience comes from, or my biggest impact comes from an experience from that, following one of the fly-ins where I met with Senator Al Franken's office and had a great discussion, connected with them. We talked about a lot of things, and following that meeting, I was back at school, walking to the library, and I got a phone call, and it was from DC, and I picked it up, and it's the chief of staff asking me questions about another bill. And I kind of had to stop him and say, like, I'm absolutely happy to help, and I want to connect you with all the people, but I just want to make clear, sure, that I'm a student. He's like, oh yeah, I know. Yep, but you just seem really, you have a lot of experience and knowledge around this and your background in public health. Like, there was all of these things. I was like, wow, if we're not there, there will be, as Dr. Teller was saying, there's somebody who will be informing them. And so, again, as a student, you don't feel like you have that much, you have so much more to offer than you realize. And I had that experience, and it was very impactful. And so it has been a big part of why I've continued to be engaged.
Yeah, I can just touch on it very briefly. The thing that sticks out to me is when I've met with other veterinarians from other states, I'm always amazed at the new policies or laws that are being introduced around the country that just amaze me with how much they could shake up a veterinary community in that state, and just how short-sighted many of them are. And it's easy to think that this always happens in a different state, or this state or that state that I don't live in has these issues come up that are so pressing and the VMAs have to really start fighting against. But then once you really start to notice what's happening in your own state, you realize that you're facing the same problems, but you have advocates there that are fighting for you. And so that has always been a motivating factor for me, that I can be that person that fights for the people in my state or around the country, to really fight for them. Because policy and politics, it's not a passive environment, it's constantly evolving. So either we can be there and we can try to guide that evolution, or it's going to pass right by us. So that's kind of my motivation, is always to make sure we have a voice there.
All really great points. Along those same lines, and for the students and soon to be new graduates, or newer graduates, one question, Matt, you touched on this a little bit as well, but we had a question from a registrant asking, related to starting this journey, should you work a while before becoming engaged in advocacy? I can probably imagine what your answers are, but do you need to work in practice before you should be involved?
So for me, I've never practiced. Obviously, I came straight out of veterinary school into another degree, essentially, and straight from there into a policy career. So I'm now out of the kind of the state policy of it, but I started advocating in school. I joined my state VMA's Legislative Advisory Committee and was an active member of that for 6 years while I was in school. So I don't think you need to practice at all. I think you already know more than enough to be an effective advocate as a student.
I would agree. You're learning all of the science, which is where most of our policymakers are lacking, is in the science piece of it. And so there's a huge contribution you can make just with that. In Texas, our legislature meets every other year. We have a legislative day. Our students from Texas A&M are invited to come, and it's an excused absence. So we tend to get a lot of people coming, which is great because that is an educational experience for them. But just as an example, probably 3 or 4 sessions ago, I was at Legislative Day with a person who was a student at the time, and we were going from office to office together, and one of the guards walks by with one of the random bomb sniffing dogs, and the dog was limping. And the student's like, should we say something? Do we say something? And so we stopped and chatted with the guard and were able to get help, one, for that dog. But it was a real bonding experience for that student, because not only was he learning the importance of advocacy, but he was also learning the importance of organized veterinary medicine and the networking opportunities there. He's now serving on the board of directors of Texas VMA. He's on our government relations committee, and his goal actually is one day now to be a politician. But it's those kinds of impacts that it can have. When he was looking for a new job, just because of the networking he had built from all of this, he had lots of contacts to find a new job too. So the advocacy piece, which is what we're talking about, is the biggest piece of it. And so I don't want to minimize the importance of that, because that's why we're here and it's super important. But it's all the fringe benefits to partaking in that you also develop from actively engaging. So I want that to be recognized as well.
Absolutely.
I'm going to jump in really quick answer as well. I think I have 3 answers to this. First, being in agreement that I don't think you have to practice at all. Like, you can do this, as I experienced as a student, you have an incredible amount of knowledge to share. The other answer is you don't have to pick. I mean, you can be doing advocacy work and be practicing. That's what I'm doing now. And so it doesn't have to be, one or the other. And then the other answer is, I think it does. I mean, I have, been in practice for 8 years, and there's a certain amount of additional street cred you get from, if you're talking about a food animal bill, and that I've spent time on farms, and you can connect with an environment and a place, and even a reality, even informing policy, having been on farms and barns, in the small animal clinic, in chicken raising operations. I mean, there's a huge amount of information that's added by doing practice as well. So, but it's not necessary.
Can I say one more thing? Sorry.
Sure.
I think it's also important to know that advocacy work does not have to be this all-consuming thing, right? We're talking because we're very engaged with it. But if you're a student or a recent grad and you're like, oh my God, I don't have all that kind of time, advocacy work, it can be as simple as making a phone call or writing a letter. So it may be 5 minutes out of your day 3 times a year, but that phone call or that letter can be extremely impactful, especially if you personalize it, so you can tell your own story as to how this piece of legislation will be good or bad for you, as well as the profession, as opposed to just the canned responses that sometimes you can send out. So I think that's important, especially for our students and newer graduates, to recognize that this isn't something that you have to devote days and weeks and months to. It can really be a few minutes out of your day during legislative season. So
that is so true. Doesn't have to be your day job.
No.
So let's jump into some discussion about some specific examples of state legislation or regulations that were impacted by veterinarian advocates like yourself. So maybe some of the projects or initiatives that you all have worked on. Matt, we'd love to hear about an advocacy campaign there in Michigan that you were heavily involved.
Sure. So this was a big learning experience for me that's happened over the past 2 years that I kind of was probably the thing I was most involved in while I was on the Legislative Advisory Committee in Michigan. So our state passed a recreational marijuana law a little less than 2 years ago. And after that happened, we obviously saw CBD and other cannabis products popping up all over the state. And so veterinarians were not only seeing more toxicity cases, but they were getting a lot of questions from patients or clients about, what can they use? What's the best product? What are the health benefits? And veterinarians were concerned about talking with clients about these issues because of the legal ramifications and potentially losing their license. So when I was with AVMA on the Hill, one of my jobs was to work with the head office or the main office, and we actually did a background document on cannabis. So I was a little bit familiar with some of the federal policies, but not so much on a state level. So when I heard these kind of rumblings in the state, I brought this to the committee, the Legislative Advisory Committee, and kind of said, look, this is an issue. We have a lot of veterinarians, especially younger veterinarians, that want to be active in this new industry and at least being an expert and making sure people are being safe. And it's something we probably need to address. And I got some pushback. I think there's a lot of people that didn't really want to touch it, being a federal issue as well. They felt that the state didn't necessarily have a role. But I convinced that our group, or our CEO at least, to bring in some members from the state government. So we had a member of the Attorney General's office and a member of the licensing board essentially come in and speak with a large group of veterinarians to try to give us their opinion on kind of what was happening with cannabis in the state. And essentially what we found out was a very eye-opening experience that even though we had these new laws and we had members of state government there, they weren't able to tell us how the state was going to interpret the laws. So essentially when veterinarians asked if they could make recommendations or if they could talk to people about overdoses, anything like that, they were told that they don't know if that could affect their license or not because there hadn't been a court case on it, because the judicial branch is the one that decides how the law is interpreted. So it kind of left a lot of veterinarians and our member organization kind of clueless and a little worried. And so obviously it was a great time for us to then become involved and try to make a policy that could then kind of close these loopholes and make it crystal clear about how we can be protected as an industry. And so very conveniently about that time, a representative that we weren't in touch with just at the same time happened to introduce a bill that kind of covered both pets and CBD. And they were very open to talking with us about our wants and needs. And so as a legislative committee, we were able to come up with a list of, these are the things we want to see in a bill. These are the things we don't want to see in a bill. And then we kind of drafted a no-nonsense list of these are the things we'd love to see. What ended up coming out of that was something that was kind of unrelated to what we had presented them. Instead of having restrictions on what veterinarians could do, they basically wrote a bill that allowed veterinarians to do anything they wanted with cannabis and CBD. So they went a little farther than we had wanted. And that was a little bit unexpected, but it was something we could work with. And this is where I really started to learn a lot was our lobbyist and CEO, who is very politically savvy. They kind of realized that this was an opportunity not to continually edit and fidget with the bill, but to get some momentum. And in policy, it seems that momentum is everything. So the plan was to start moving the bill through the House, get it through the House. And once it was through the House, we had some senators that we were a little more understanding about the issue, and then we could do some editing of the bill in the Senate. Now, that's about when COVID hit and everything slowed way down. So our hopes and dreams for this bill, this legislative session, kind of went out the window. But that's okay. Things get pushed back all the time. So we're still very excited for it. We think it's going to be a good bill and hoping it'll move into the next step in the next legislative session. But kind of the next step we had been already planning for was getting members to start to get behind this bill because it was an issue we saw as affecting almost every veterinarian in Michigan. We were really planning on, how are we going to get veterinarians from across the state to get behind this bill, to start contacting representatives, to try to get people pushing. Because it's such a touchy subject for a lot of people, we knew that this might be a tough sell to a lot of representatives and senators. So it's definitely, now that I'm out of the state, living in Virginia now, I'm not quite as connected, but I know it'll be a big push from the Michigan VMA to really get members and especially students to connect with legislators and try to get this bill moving and keep that momentum going forward.
What do you think was the biggest challenge sort of through the initial phases of or through not even just the initial phases? Y'all made some great inroads there. What do you think was the biggest challenge?
I think the biggest, for me, it was getting other veterinarians to remain open-minded about new, I don't want to say medications or pharmaceuticals, but new subjects that really I wasn't taught about them in vet school. They weren't taught about them in vet school. So we don't have a lot of information, but still at least being open-minded about, what do we know? What don't we know? If we don't know something, how do we find it out? And then just trying to sell at least, let's do best by the pets. And so let's try to write a bill where we can at least warn or talk to clients about the dangers of using CBD. We don't necessarily have to recommend it or prescribe it. So a lot of what we did was modeled after the California bill. California just put forth a bill of how to discuss CBD as a veterinarian without prescribing or recommending. And that was kind of the path we took. And so it was kind of a middle road of let's have good conversations about it in a logical way with clients, but let's also not push it or try to make recommendations since we really don't have a lot of information yet about it.
Sure. Great. Thanks for that. And Lindsay, how about in Washington? There were a couple of successful initiatives that you were a part of there. If you could tell us about those.
Yes. So the most recent ones was the we were added actually. They were going through an already existing bill that did suicide prevention with a lot of professions around the state. So social workers, family and marriage therapists, physicians, nurses, all of these professions. Part of their CE and licensure requirement includes suicide prevention and well-being work. CE, that's just part of their license. So I don't actually, one of the representatives who works with our state organization quite a bit kind of had knowledge, because we've worked with her enough about the concern around suicide prevalence in our profession, and wanted to add veterinarians to this group and this requirement, which obviously I think is very well intended and great, and we should do that. But obviously our situation and some of those the structures and reasons why we have issues are very different when it's not human focused, and there's a lot of different pressures. So one of the things we advocated for through our organization was having us come up with our own program. So yes, we want to be part of this. We think this is really important. I think we can benefit our profession, but let us develop our own basically material for it. And so the bill just passed in June, and so which is great. So we have until 2022 to come up with that, and we are working as an organization with many of the wonderful experts we have around the country to develop that right now. So that's really exciting. And then the other one has to do with animal welfare. That one is just introduced into the House right now, and so isn't going anywhere immediately, but that came to us in really immediate kind of need input right now. This is a concern because it was really well-intended groups, and the GRD office in DC is, very familiar with all of the concerns around, tail docking, ear cropping, devocalization rules. And every state manages that differently. And so that was one that came up for us recently. And so it was several groups kind of coming together and saying, this should be illegal across the board for these procedures to be done in any way. And so, of course, just trying to make sure that we are looking out for our profession. We basically helped within 24 hours, just kind of give our input across several different areas of practice. Like, this is really concerning because some of these procedures, especially the language said under anesthesia. Well, we're not going to put 3-day-old puppies under anesthesia, but they need to be pain managed appropriately. And so the language needs to reflect a way that you can do procedures safely. And also not put a veterinarian that might be doing a, resection in the larynx at risk of a legal issue if they end up inadvertently devocalizing a dog in a surgery, and we have an upset client that then has legal ability to basically retaliate and be able to sue. So those are just situations where it sounds like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, but it's not. When you kind of think about all the different situations, and that we should be involved in that conversation and be responsible for doing things appropriately for animals and for clients. So basically, it was me serving on the board that really was that input, but I was also going out to members and getting information and bouncing ideas off of. So not as involved as Dr. Kuhn, but that's how I do practice. I'm practicing, but I'm also doing advocacy work by providing that voice. And so that's the roles I'm playing at this time.
Absolutely. And why do you think, particularly with the suicide prevention bill, what do you think sort of came into play to make that effort so successful? Because of course what was proposed initially, right, it was great that the representative was familiar with the organization and the veterinary profession and came to everyone. I feel like that's probably a win anyway, but then to have it to be successful in getting it amended in the way that you wanted, what do you think, I guess, came into play there?
I think it was, again, all of the knowledge that we have around how prevalent this is in our profession. I mean, people just don't know, but if they come and ask any student or anybody who's, a veterinarian in this country, they know that this is a problem. And so it's really just informing that policy. It's really impactful. But also then being able to give really specific examples, access to euthanasia solution. That's not what any of these other practices, for the most part, don't have that kind of easy access to those types of situations. So I think it was, again, just informing people in these positions about the impact that this could have for good in our profession.
Great. No, absolutely. Thank you. And Lori, I know, as you mentioned, you're involved in advocacy at both the federal level with the AVMA and then very involved there in Texas. How about a hot topic that requires veterinarians' voices and engagement?
Definitely. So telemedicine is a very hot topic. It was a hot topic before the pandemic, and that's only gotten hotter since the COVID crisis. But this is something that almost every state has struggled with across the country, plus Puerto Rico and DC. Certainly Texas has looked at it, but it's also a great example of where state VMAs and the AVMA work together. So just a couple of examples. Alaska recently proposed some regulations about defining a VCPR, and there was not going to be any requirement for an in-person exam with that. And that really did not sit well with the Alaska VMA. And so they wanted some good arguments to counteract the proposed law. And they reached out to the AVMA, who was able to provide them with some background materials, some letters of support, also some talking points that the state VMA could then disperse to their members. And after all of that happened, the legislature in Alaska stepped back. They really took that to heart. There were things that they had not been considering, and they are now working on revamping the language in their proposed regulation, and they're working with the Alaska VMA to do that. Another state that struggled as well is Nevada. Their state board was proposing a VCPR rule with some pretty wide latitude, and it was getting to the point where it's getting a little bit nasty. And it happened to be during Western Veterinary Conference this past year that the state board and the state VMA, they had an emergency meeting. And since I was attending Western, I was invited to partake in that. And again, it really helps when you, as the veterinarian who are in the trenches and can provide some expertise on these topics, can meet with the legislators and the regulators. We got to remember that it's not just a state legislature that's working to pass laws that may not be appropriate for the profession. There are regulatory agencies that also don't always understand what's happening in the trenches. And so we can advocate at all of those levels, both congressional and legislatively and regulatory. And so again, Nevada stepped back and they're reevaluating as well what the regulations are going to look like in Nevada. So it really, you can make a tremendous difference. Don't hesitate to mobilize your own people in the state, and also look for outside resources. Matt touched it on earlier, how what happens in one state can really not only shake up the profession in that state, but have repercussions in other states across the country. So use your other resources, your colleagues and other state VMAs, the AVMA, things like that, because it really can be very impactful when you're dealing with these kind of advocacy issues.
Absolutely. Like you said, we often see things track across the country or trend, you know, in one state to then a couple of states, as Lindsay said, with things like the scope of practice or the different issues like that. So one question that came in from an attendee was asking, saying that we've entered an era where expert opinion is readily discounted for web information and brand ads. How can we express expertise as veterinarians? And I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but just wanted to get your thoughts on really on how we can go about doing that. I don't know who might want to start, but
I'll say one thing. One of the things that I saw as a student doing advocacy work in DC, but also serving as a key legislative contact in Washington, one of the things that we've all been touching on are bills that have been brought up and are coming out that we are responding to, but also reacting to. And so one of the great pieces that we can develop in this process is relationship building. And so each time I get to meet with a legislator, I talk about specific bills. I thank them for ones they've supported in the past and all of this, but I'm also then opening the conversation and talking about other areas where they may not have thought about veterinarians as a resource, whether it be breed-specific legislation. I mean, there's always a lot of, you know, management and real estate thing. I mean, there's insurance, there's so many other things, but there isn't always the thought of, oh, maybe a veterinarian is a good resource for this, or talking about public health if we're talking about support animals on planes and safety, and, you know, are we checking fecals on dogs that are going to planes, things like that, you know. So you bring these things up, and watching legislators go, oh, I never thought about that. And so I think that helps build integrity in your relationship, and also as a profession that's removed from being tied to a specific association or coming at it from an angle. So I think it adds and builds credibility.
Really great point. Matt or Lori?
Yeah, I think a lot is in, yeah, I completely agree with what Lindsay said. And I think a lot is also in our approach. So these legislators may have a hard time accepting scientific opinion, but we also don't know what their source of information is. And so I think a lot of it is just how we approach them. We can't say, oh, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard, because we've eventually just immediately made them defensive and turned them off. But if we can approach them as, hey, I'm a veterinarian, I'm your constituent, this is what I'm dealing with, and this is how what you're proposing could have a negative impact. I'm a little bit concerned about some of the information that you've heard. Let me tell you about, and then have some documented information that you can share. You always need to keep it short and sweet. They don't need somebody's thesis. But if you can certainly summarize things factually in a language they understand, then that goes a long way to establishing your credentials. And you do need to keep coming back. It's not a one and done thing. But again, this may just be 5 or 10 minutes of your time every so often. But eventually they're going to be like, you know, she was respectful when she was trying to tell me I was an idiot. And so I'm going to go back and get her opinion on this particular instance. So
Right. No, very true. And Matt, any thoughts?
I think one thing for me is to remember that we're not just scientists as veterinarians, not just medical people. A lot of us are small business owners, a lot of us, or we work at a small business likely. A lot of us are involved in some kind of public health, or we're involved in the food supply chain. And so you can make sure people understand that your skills in medicine go beyond just being a veterinarian. You're involved in all these different types of policy that legislatures really care about. You know, they know that everybody in all their constituents eat, so they are going to care about the food supply. They know that everybody has to stay healthy, so they're going to care about public health. And so you can insert these other aspects of our education and what we have knowledge and skills in to kind of bolster your influence to them, as well as your trustworthiness and helpfulness to them.
No, exactly. Very good points. Like you said, a lot of different areas that we have expertise in that we may not even think about that often. Along those lines, and I know y'all each talked about some of the specific areas that you'd worked on or been engaged in, but how do you go about keeping yourself informed? One of the questions that came in was, is any extra education necessary for being a strong advocate? And just how do you keep yourself informed to find out about bills? Maybe you're not serving on the VMA's board of directors or on the legislative committee or things like that, but how do you keep yourself informed, find out about things going on, and yeah, if any extra education is really needed? Do we want to start? We'll start with Matt this time.
Okay. So one of the first things I did when I started getting involved in the policy was to try to figure out how I can track legislation. And so there are the veterinary specific areas, so you can get involved with AVMA through their national or the AVMA Advocate or the state legislative update, where you're getting, I think it's monthly updates or so about kind of what's happening, and then alerts if something really pressing happens and we need action. But then you can go to congress.gov and set up keyword searches. So if there is any kind of subject you're interested in, even if it's not veterinary medicine, you can set up keyword searches to get updates on any new bills that are introduced, or things that are moving through the pipeline. And then in Michigan, at least, I set up updates for when certain subjects were either introduced or moved along, so I could keep track of how things were being introduced, or if they were going to go anywhere, if they weren't going anywhere. And so that was one of the first things I did, just to kind of get an idea of what bills are out there, what kind of bills are realistically moving along, and what kind of things just kind of get introduced and sit. And then beyond that, if you're involved in agriculture, Politico.com has a weekly agriculture update they send out that does a really good job of covering the policy related to agriculture at the federal level, at least. I think that's about it. And then just reading a lot, reading SAVMA, reading AJVR, things like that, to kind of keep up with what the big news is.
Great. No, absolutely, a lot of great resources, and happy to have folks sign up and receive and read through the AVMA Advocate and our state legislative updates. Lori, thoughts from you on how do you keep yourself informed?
Well, I think Matt just gave the perfect answer, of course.
Yeah.
But most state VMAs also send out their own legislative updates via email, so definitely worth getting those. They typically have some good talking points in them. Great way to stay informed. And of course, if you do want to be more involved, it pays to reach out to either your state VMA leadership or the executive director. Several states also have their own government relations person. Just let them know that you would like more information on a topic. These are things they love to talk about. And so they are happy to share whatever information that you may need, just so you're better informed on the topic. And if you want to talk to a legislator about a specific issue, they can even provide you with talking points, so you don't have to feel like you're just making stuff up out of the air. It gives you something to keep focused on, because most meetings with legislators tend to be pretty short anyway. And so that, to me, I think is the best way to go. I've been known to frequently reach out to ours in Texas, just say, hey, I'm even just hearing rumblings about something. Have you been hearing this? What do you think about it? What do you know? Is there somebody that you're connected with that you can get some information on? And they're always so happy when a member's engaged like that. They're so happy to provide that kind of information.
Absolutely. Any extra spots, Lindsay, that you look or?
No, there's a complete list there. I feel like the only other thing I will add is I think a really fun way to, especially state to state, is if you can hear about any kind of town halls. I mean, this is one advantage. Let's find the silver linings where we can for COVID. But there's a lot of virtual town halls happening with legislators around the country that you can just log into and listen, and it's really interesting to learn about these issues from their viewpoint. I mean, and their perspective, and right on the ground floor of a lot of these things, and hearing about what's going on I've been doing a few of those, and it's been incredibly interesting and informative.
Perfect. I think along those same lines, with the newsletters, the legislators, whether it's your local, your state, your federal, they have newsletters that they send out that you can sign up for, or even just following them on social media. Some of them are incredibly active on social media. So I think some definitely lots of ways out there to be informed. And then one of the questions that came from registrant was, how many different veterinary subjects do you feel you need to keep up on? I don't know if how y'all approach that, since like we said, there are so many different things that could impact the profession overall, but how you sort of, do you just pick one that's your passion project, or do you just sort of throw the net out there and see what comes up, or how do y'all approach that? I don't know who wants to go first. We
I
can
can go
circle back to
briefly.
Matt if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay.
I kind of went the passion project route. So I love to chat about antibiotic resistance just because that kind of is what excites me. It's very research oriented, so I can really dig into it. So that's definitely what I focus on. If I just want to read or learn more about something, I can dive forever really deep into that. There are a lot of subjects, like especially a lot of the taxation issues or small business issues that I know very little about. And then there are a lot of issues kind of in the middle where I know a broad level view of them, but not a ton. I know enough to have a conversation. And that if I needed to have a conversation with somebody about it, like a legislator, I could dive in quickly because I have a broad view. And that's kind of how I approach most things. If I can get a decent idea of what's happening, then if the opportunity arises to advocate for that, I can quick dive into it and then move on.
Lori,
Yeah, I was
Lindsay?
my oh
Go ahead,
my
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
my I agree. And my passion is public health, so those are the ones that I follow that more closely. I love to be involved where I can, but it's kind of this applies to students and us. Whatever you're at right now, you've proven that you can learn things, and you can synthesize information. And so it may not be something you're up to date on, but you'll be able to learn what you need to know and be able to deliver that in a meaningful way to whoever you're speaking with in very quick order. And again, you're carrying more information than you realize, and you'll be able to communicate that in a way. You'd be so surprised. Like, I'm not up, I'll give a quick story also. When I was in the same meeting with Senator Franken's office, I walked in and I was going to talk about, I think it was the double-decker horse trailer legislation at the time, and walked in and they had the letter of the antibiotic resistance that I'd sent into them, the PAMTA issue that was going on at the time on antibiotic resistance. And I had done the form letter from AVMA and sent it in, but I did notes in the margins and everything. They had it out on the table when I came in there and talked with them. I mean, so it was one of those things where I didn't come in prepared to talk about that. But you kind of refresh your mind and you jump into it. And again, way more than the person sitting across the table from you in most cases, unless it's Dick Harris, which it was, but yes.
No, very good point. Lori, any?
Yeah, so it's really kind of a great question. So obviously I have my passion projects, but I'm also somebody veterinary medicine's really interesting because we're one of the most trusted professions out there, but we're also always the underdog because we're so tiny. So I have this incredible drive to fight for the underdog, and that just also happens to be self-survival too, I guess. So I try to stay informed on a multitude of topics, and as has been brought up, you can't know everything about everything. But we know where to go, and so it's okay if a legislator asks you a question about something that you feel like you don't have enough information about, to say, I know a little bit about this. I really want to make sure I'm providing you with accurate information. I am going to go look up some stuff, and whatever that means, whether that means going to AVMA, your state AVMA, or wherever you need to go. And I will get back to you by 5 o'clock today or by noon tomorrow, whatever it is, and then do that. And that's just another way that you're building trust with that legislator. And so even if you don't know it right then, we are lifelong learners and we have access to that information, and we can get it to them when they need it.
Yes, a frequent refrain is, I'm really not certain, but I will find the answer for you and be back in touch.
Yes.
So along some of the lines, I think, Lindsay, you had touched on it right now with finding silver linings during this time of social distancing and the pandemic. But what ways can we involve ourselves during this time of social distancing? I know you had mentioned that for one of them, but sort of any more thoughts for students or new grads on how they can be engaged during this time when they maybe can't go in and meet with a legislator or come to the AVMA fly-in or go to a Hill visit with the state VMA?
Yeah. Letter writing, again, that example for me, I mean, that means a lot. I mean, they definitely track that. So that is not out of style, out of fashion. Definitely you can send letters. That's an easy answer there. But again, the virtual town hall meetings that are happening are pretty fun to watch. It's I think most people, I don't know, that aren't really involved with advocacy might be like, I don't know, but I think I would challenge anybody to sit on one of those and not be intrigued. So there's that, as well as, you know, I still hope to meet with some legislators, if possible, through these types of calls and doing virtual visits, you know, and it may, again, only be 5-7 minutes that you have with them, but, you know, this is becoming the new norm. And I think there's definitely ways to still connect.
Anything else you'd like to add to that, Lori? Or
Oh, sure. I mean, I've done Zoom meetings with legislators, so that's definitely a way. They've gotten quite adept at that. Phone calls and letter writing, those never go out of style, and you can do that social distancing. And I think another thing that you can also consider, I mean, if there is a legislator that you really identify with on multiple levels and that you would vote for this legislator and you're not just concerned about one piece of advocacy, is you can serve on that person's campaign. So volunteer to reach out to your colleagues, things like that. The other thing is social media. They all have a presence on social media, so you can respond to posts they put up. You can direct message some of them. So there are lots of ways, sitting on the sofa with your phone or sitting in front of your computer, that you can still be involved and reach out to those people and let them know your thoughts and opinions and offer to be a source of information for them.
Yeah, I think right now is also a great time to consider writing an op-ed. If you have a timely subject that you feel passionate about, I think it's a great time, since you're at home writing, to try to learn to write one. Try to find someone that has had success in the past getting them published and can kind of, I had to work with a couple people that have written them in the past and learn how to completely change my writing style to be very concise, to be clear to write to the public. And it took me much longer than I thought to write one, but given that we're at home and maybe have the time, maybe not, depending on where you're at in school, I think it's a good opportunity to learn how to write a really good op-ed and get your thoughts out there to the public. And I think I think we underestimate how much op-eds are read by legislators and representatives and senators at the local and national level. That's one of the ways they keep the pulse on their constituents and how people are feeling. So if you can get your voice out there, that's one way you can influence them kind of indirectly and have your voice heard.
no, great. A lot of great ideas there. And sort of tied to this, a registrant had asked, how often do you meet with legislators? And we'll consider that even during these times, some of these other touch points, whether that's the letters, the emails, phone calls. But how often, how do you all approach your frequency in reaching out to policymakers?
I think for me, it just depends on what the topic is. And if it's during session, if there's a bill that's moving, then it's something you're going to want to reach out frequently and say, hey, this bill really needs to keep moving and don't let somebody derail it, or this bill is really awful, can you derail it? And just state your reasons why. If something is just languishing in committee, it depends on if I want to even draw attention to it or not. So if my representative or senator happens to be on that committee, of course I'm going to reach out. But otherwise, I may just let it be dormant and not draw attention to it. So a lot really depends on what the issue is and how quickly it seems to be moving.
Great. Lindsay?
I can say in practice, and this was talked about earlier, is like, not having to pick one or the other. I mean, I balance working with wanting to stay involved. And so one-on-one meetings, literally for me, probably only happen once or twice a year at this point, but they're really impactful. And I remain, you know, serving that role as a key legislative contact, it is really, I think, nice for the state associations to have those touch points, because it can be a certain district, a certain bill that they can then come back to me, and they know that at any point in time they can tap my shoulder and just say, hey, would you mind writing an email? Would you mind writing a letter? And again, that's going to take, you know, 15 minutes for me to write a letter, and that goes a long way. So I'm definitely in the camp right now, being that this isn't my full-time gig, that yeah, it doesn't take a ton of time, but it's huge, and I think it goes a long way.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, I haven't met with legislators in person a ton. During vet school and grad school, I probably met with my federal legislators about once a year, just because I was very involved with the fly-ins or externships, things like that. So I was in DC a lot. But I never really had the time to meet with my state legislators much. So it was a lot of, like everybody said, letter writing, email writing, just trying to still keep the communication open, even though it wasn't necessarily face-to-face. So I would say I wrote, it really depended on what bills were coming up and where they were, but I probably wrote an email once every 2-3 months to my representative and senator at Michigan.
Right, like y'all said, I think it depends on how hot a topic is, how much attention you want to draw to it, things like that, sort of finding that balance. And that's where I think also, as a couple of you have mentioned, sort of coordinating, whether it's with the AVMA or your state VMA, to make sure that your efforts are in alignment. And I think those are both really great resources for
Can I add on
how to navigate that? Sure.
Can I add on something to that? Because we're talking so much about meeting with our legislators, which is obviously of the utmost importance, but frequently we're really meeting with staffers. And even when we're sending letters and emails, they get routed to the appropriate staffer that is covering that issue. So it pays to know who that is sometimes, especially if you're going to be meeting in person, because various staff members have various focuses, whether it's animal welfare, human healthcare, all the different things. But especially for the people on this webinar who are students and about to be recent grads, staffers are about your age. Most of them are somewhere in their 20s and early 30s. And so y'all have something that somebody in my generation doesn't even have, and that's cultural relationships. There's ways to bond at the cultural level, just generationally. And so that's something that y'all can use when you're having these meetings, and whether it's letter writing, Zoom town halls, Facebook Live, whatever, is you can relate to them on that level. And that's also another way of building rapport and trust with the staff person, who's then going to be like, oh, that vet student said, and she really seemed to know what she was talking about, or he knew about this topic. And so that message, it's just another way that that staff person is more likely to, one, reach back out to you, but also to pass on your message when helping the legislator formulate policy as well.
Absolutely. No, you're right. Staffers are very important in the relationship building process. So we're coming up here on the end of the hour, but I would like to give y'all a chance if there's anything else you'd like to share, or any sort of final advice for students or the new graduates as they look to get engaged, get their foot in the door, get involved. Any last thoughts here? We'll start. I'll circle back to Matt. We'll start and I'll go around my screen.
Okay. I have 2 quick pieces of advice. So the first is to try to develop you want to build your network. And we talk about that constantly, about a career network, but I think there's also, if you want to be an advocate, to build an advocate network. And that doesn't have to be people necessarily at AVMA or your state VMA or anything like that, but just other people in your state and around the country that are excited about advocacy and want to be active. There's no way that we can all track all of the legislation. We can't always come up with all of the different ways to approach different topics, but the more people you can have involved and have to bounce ideas off of, the better that's going to be. And so just try to meet as many people as you can and share your passion with them. And the second piece of advice is just to always ask for opportunities. When it comes to advocacy, or if you want a career in it, or if it's just a passion on the side, there's a lot of opportunities available to you as a student, but you have to ask. If you want to do an externship somewhere, go ask that government organization if you can do an externship with them, or if you want it, it's a non-government organization, go ask. If you want to bring a representative to your school to show off your school, what you guys do, ask your dean about it or ask somebody at the school about it. I think there's so many opportunities available to us. We just have to ask for it.
Absolutely. Lori?
Agree. Don't be shy. Even if you are shy, don't be shy. Reach out to your state leadership, as Matt said. If you have, especially if you're pursuing something that you're passionate about, none of our organizations typically can go it alone. So we're working with allies. So if you have friends that have an interest in a particular topic that you share an interest in, recruit them as well to participate in that. Find a mentor. We talk about mentorship a lot, but you can also have an advocacy mentor. And so if you have identified a veterinarian or somebody who is well connected, ask them if they will introduce you to a legislator or a staffer. That can really, really go a long way. So you never get what you don't ask for. And if you don't ask, it's automatically a no. If you ask, it may be a no, but it may be a yes. It may even be better than a yes. So.
Great. And Lindsay?
Yeah. I would say I would just encourage students to, echoing what's already been said, but to really take those opportunities to be involved as a student. That was, it's kind of a place to be able to do things where you have a little bit of this, it's like a safety net in the background where you can, you're a student, you're learning, there's a certain exception that comes along with that you can learn so much and have these experiences and be able to leave so much more confidently to go and continue that work in whatever capacity you choose. But when you get out into practice or whatever avenue you're going, there's going to be so much new information. So to try and pick up that advocacy, even though you really wanted to do it, you'll try it sometime. It can feel overwhelming. I would never discourage anybody from getting involved at any point in time, but I think it reduces a lot of barriers by just taking those opportunities to be involved as a student. And so I would say go for it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, with that, we are just over our time, so we'll wrap things up. We really want to extend an enormous thank you to our panelists for their insights and participation. And thank you, of course, to the attendees for your interest in advocacy. We will make a recording of this session available, as well as provide some advocacy-related resources from both the AVMA and SAVMA. And we will answer any questions that we were not able to get to during the webinar. We will get those questions answered and back to the folks who asked them. Please don't hesitate to be in touch if you have any questions going forward, and we look forward to your engagement. Thank you.